Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Dr. no less, Elora Voyles, who is an industrial organizational psychologist and people scientist, blimey, with TINYpulse. Hi, Elora. How are you doing?
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're very welcome. Now, Elora, can you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch on you and your background and sort of the work that you kind of do and all of that sort of jazz?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, as you said, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, which means I got a PhD in psychology, and specifically focusing on IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology. What that focuses on is measuring employee experiences, developing trainings, focusing on leadership, and what organizations and employees need to be successful. So I got that degree at Northern Illinois University, and I thought that I wanted to be an academic. So I became a professor, and I was an assistant professor for almost 4 years, and I wasn't really enjoying it. I enjoyed the research and I enjoyed the teaching, but there were other aspects that I didn't love. So I transitioned out by becoming a consultant, and ultimately I work with TINYpulse, a limeade company, as a people scientist. And if you're wondering what a people scientist is, a people scientist essentially collects research and data and then comes up with conclusions and recommendations based on what employees are experiencing.
That sounds super interesting. I thought for a minute that you were going to be wandering around with a lab coat and a magnifying glass just watching people.
I think that sounds like a fun illustration, and I would love a lab coat, but I don't currently have one.
Oh, well, never mind. Maybe you can fit in for one. You're like going, I want a lab coat. But I know that the part of that collecting research and conducting research and collecting research around the employee experience, this is one of the things that kind of brought us together to arrange this podcast, because you recently wrote an article just back in early December called "The Zoom Ceiling is the New Glass Ceiling," that I thought touched on and highlighted some really interesting challenges, with the move to a more hybrid way of working, or fully remote, or back to the office, or people can't make up their minds right now because things are still in flux. So for the benefit of the listeners, and also kind of people that might be reading the highlights, can you tell us tell me about the article and what its main thesis is?
I'd be happy to. So I was thinking a lot about the pandemic and how we made this switch to remote work and hybrid work without much thought other than just trying to keep working. The focus was on, okay, let's keep everyone working, let's keep everyone safe. But I've thought more and more about it, that there could be unanticipated consequences of these changes. And one of these consequences is, we're working more remotely, it's more accepted. But without understanding how remote workers are impacted. the Zoom ceiling really gets at this idea that remote workers don't have the same opportunities, or likely won't have the same opportunities as in-person workers. And
Right.
this comes from, for example, leaders just not acknowledging as much their accomplishments or not seeing them. And it also comes from biases that leaders may have.
Right. So let's get into some of those things that you highlighted, because the whole sort of thing around remote workers facing this Zoom ceiling, as it were. Yeah, that's kind of quite concerning, particularly because I remember in the article you highlighted, or you quoted a Stanford study from 2015, I believe, where in the article they'd found that although remote workers are more productive compared to their in-office colleagues, their promotion rates were roughly half compared to those in the office. So, I mean, that's exactly to what you were talking about. But what is actually happening here that leaders need to be aware of? Because that feels like a real blind spot.
Yeah, so we have this fact, that Stanford study you just mentioned. We also have more. So it's not just that they are more productive. I checked out a recent Robert Half study, which is an LA-based firm, and they also said that remote workers are putting in more hours per day. And then in my own research, just last week, I was analyzing some data on worker commitment, as far as how likely they felt they would keep working at their job, their current position, for the next year. And there were no differences based on remote work, in person, or hybrid. So we very much have an equivalent workforce when we compare remote versus in person. But as you've highlighted, and as it's stated in the article, remote workers are not getting the same opportunities.
And is that because that, I think you alluded to it in your previous kind of comment, you talked about kind of these like biases. I mean, are these biases, are they focused on a particular kind of people, or are they just making assumptions about, or are they doing both?
It's a little bit of both. So there are first the biases. And some of these they can be explicit biases where it's like, I think that remote workers are not as dedicated. In fact, there was this kind of comment that the Goldman Sachs CEO made about remote work being terrible, and just kind of very much having this knee-jerk reaction against it. There are leaders who may have these explicit feelings of being against remote work. That's kind of the outright knowing that remote workers may have biases against them. There's also the more subtle biases. These may not be available to see on the surface, but it could be, when managers just don't notice what remote workers are contributing, or they aren't as focused on the idea of them contributing and becoming potentially leaders in their organization because they're remote workers.
Right.
But this may not be consciously thought of.
Yeah. I mean, and does that butt up against, it's like, it feels a bit like a control thing, because you talk about the kind of the Goldman Sachs person. And I know that there's this almost like there's this sense of power and authority and control can come from how people view the world, and almost like, I need to be in charge of all these people that I survey, as it were. And if they're here, kind of like that, and I can see them, then it feels like they might just be, because there's the other sort of things around being in office and presenteeism and all that type of stuff, where people kind of long hours just kind of like going at their keyboard, kind of like, looking like they're busy, but actually not getting very much stuff done. So it's almost a bit like, you almost have to, it feels like we have to get through that sort of barrier, or be cognizant of how other people see the world and what they think about control and authority and output and productivity and all these different sort of things. And I think the whole pandemic has like gone and shaken that up. And now, because we're getting to that point where we're starting to think about back to the office or hybrid, different type of blend. I mean, move the slider kind of wherever is appropriate. And that's sort of butting up against some of these pre-pandemic traditional kind of like ways of kind of doing things. And it's almost a bit like you see some of the people that are like struggling with it, and some of these leaders that are struggling with it. And it feels to me, that feels like it's more about them than it is about the employees.
I love that you highlighted that. It brings me back to a very traditional theory that's talked about in industrial organizational psychology. It's called the X and Y theory of leadership.
Is that McGregor?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're familiar. I'll just kind of, for the audience, in case they're not familiar,
Sure.
X theory kind of, or the X part, suggests that certain managers are very much stuck in this perspective that workers will only work if they are made to work. They don't want to. They're not intrinsically motivated. The Y part of the theory is, these managers believe that workers can be motivated and can enjoy and find meaning in their work. And I very much think, while that might be a very simplified framework, that we can think of managers somewhat in that way, that some may not be comfortable knowing that workers are going to be able to accomplish their tasks on their own without that micromanaging.
Right.
So they may not be great leaders of remote workers if they can't trust their employees.
Yeah, because we were talking about before we can like switched on record, this idea that the move to remote working was forced upon many, or at least the many that could work remotely. And leaders were told to look after their staff. But then it started to show up in the data that actually leaders were looking after the staff, but nobody was really looking after the leaders. And it seems to me that what emerged, and it's no surprise, but what emerged was that we made some big assumptions about the capability of leaders to operate in a different way, and actually shown that actually in this new world, that's probably one of the biggest Achilles heels of organizations. Is almost like you need a different type of leader, or a leader that's with new capabilities in order to operate in this hybrid kind of like world. And so, yeah, so here's my kind of my question is like, we talked about assumptions and biases and stuff. I mean, how should leaders be approaching this to make sure they're not working in they're not working in a non or inequitable or non-equitable way, whichever way is the right sort of prefix to that, making sure they're giving fair and balanced treatment to everybody. There you go. That's a better way of saying it.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I've given a lot of thought to this, and I think you're right. There hasn't been enough focus on the types of leaders we need for remote work. And I think it is distinctly different, the managers of remote workers versus in-person managers. In terms of the skills that they need, I'm going to go a little off script from what my article says, just to kind of give a more fluffy and kind of blanket statement. But I think part of it's trust,
right?
Trust and listening to employees. I have more kind of like nitty gritty recommendations as well. But I think that remote managers have to be able to communicate with their employees and trust them to be able to complete the task.
Mm-hmm. But I guess that also needs to be, well, actually, before we get to that, let's kind of like just circle back a little bit, because I wanted to ask whether there's, you talk about this Zoom ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And I also noticed in the article that you also highlight some groups that are disproportionately affected with this. And I wanted to make sure that kind of people were aware about the types of, or the groups of kind of people that are disproportionately affected by this kind of Zoom ceiling that's been uncovered by your research. So if you tell me about those kind of, those groups of people, because if we kind of, I guess if we name them and we call them out, then we know what to be aware of, right? And about how we kind of, then we could be a bit more explicit in our understanding if we are acting in a bias or a kind of poorly assumptive kind of way about these groups.
Yeah, I think definitely understanding who's more likely to be impacted can be helpful for managers because it kind of gives them something to be cognizant of, to kind of watch out.
Mm-hmm.
So there are three main groups that I would summarize as potentially being more likely to be affected. And unfortunately, these are the groups that already sometimes suffer from being targeted with biases in the workplace. The first is women. And for women, they are more likely to encounter the Zoom ceiling because they're more likely to choose remote work in order to balance home and family care responsibilities that are often placed upon them. The other group is racial minorities. There's some research, it's really interesting, that states that, particularly for Black employees, they prefer remote work because they feel more respected and they're experiencing fewer microaggressions
Right.
when everything's recorded and there aren't kind of small side conversations where those things can occur. And then the last group that I want to highlight would be people with disabilities. For people with disabilities, remote work it can be a fantastic accommodation. But for all of these groups, remote work is a natural choice given what their circumstances may be. However, there are unintended consequences, which can really result in some serious kind of detriments to their career and to their financial well-being. Missing that opportunity for a promotion means you don't get that raise.
And I guess if you can follow that logic through,
Mhm.
is if you're not getting the best out of your employees, you're not managing your talent effectively enough, then that has a negative impact on the overall employee experience, but particularly their employee experience, and then that can then feed through into the experience that you're delivering to your customers as well. So it's like it all flows through; it's all connected as well.
I agree. I've really very much taken the perspective of thinking about the employees, but you're exactly right. If you aren't selecting the best of your talent because of biases, then this means that you aren't going to be able to give the best possible customer experience. And you may not have the best leaders if you're being led by things that aren't actually important for work performance and customer experience.
Right. Yeah. So I know that you also kind of like you mentioned just earlier. You talked about the kind of like in the article you talked about getting kind of into the nitty gritty. So let's get into the nitty gritty. I mean, so we know that things are changing. We know that um, we need to be careful of the biases and assumptions that we make about whether we're dealing with remote workers or hybrid or people that are back in the office. And we know that that's having an impact on the role of the leader and the manager and what they need to do. So, what should leaders and managers be doing to make sure that they're treating all their employees, and particularly those that are working remotely, equitably? I mean, kind of what was the nitty gritty stuff? I mean, they can almost like tangible, tactical, kind of do it tomorrow, Monday, because it's Friday now, at recording day. But do it on Monday. There you go. There's your list, your to do list. Now crack on.
Yes. So for managers and leaders who are listening, the first thing I would say is to formalize remote work policies.
Mhm.
Back in March 2020, we suddenly, we went to work one day and then suddenly we didn't go back to
Mhm.
work for quite a long time. Instead, we were working, many of us, remotely. Um, we've gotten by long enough just working remotely and doing what's been kind of working for us in the meantime. But I think it's time to really formalize those remote work policies, which means communicating about expectations, communicating about expected work hours, even the amount of meetings, really making sure that remote employees and managers are clear on what's expected. I think this also can help with this is a side issue, but remote employees are working more and longer hours. Having these clear expectations can kind of give them the peace to, shut the computer down at the end of the day, which is great for preventing burnout. But these expectations can make sure that managers are comfortable knowing what their employees are doing. The next one is to keep those one-on-one meetings consistent. So make sure managers are regularly checking with employees They're using kind of a structured format. So just for meeting efficiency, it's always best to have a consistent way of running that meeting. So you know, for example, we'll talk about current projects, talk about goals. You have a structure that you follow. And I think that's important for remote workers and the managers of remote workers.
Great. I mean, I think there's also, it feels to me that when you're working at a distance and it's not about presence and time and clocking in and clocking out, you should also try and focus more on outcomes. What are the outcomes and the results and the tasks and the things that need to get done and finished, as it were? Now, I mean, I've always been an advocate for that, because then it's not about, I don't really care. It's like you pay somebody, and if they do it in 5 minutes and it's brilliant, then they've done it in 5 minutes rather than it's taking them in like 2 days. Like, who should care, right? It's like, it got done. It's brilliant. So, and it's more like that sort of, then you get into that sort of, because people get into that sort of thing around, are we paying the right sort of thing for it? And you measure people in different ways, but different people have different skills and capabilities. And some people do things faster than other people. And we all have different types of talent, as it were. And we excel in different areas. And that's the thing I would add on is, like, let people excel by focusing on the outcomes, agree what the outcomes are and how they get there. Make sure they can ask for help if they need it, but then help them get there, help them focus on getting there and producing something.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's the best way to run a remote work environment. In industrial organizational psychology, we always invent terms for things. So we call it the results-oriented work environment, which is essentially, just focused on the end product. It doesn't matter so much, what time you're working, or even in some cases how you're doing it, but it's a matter of producing. But I think sometimes some managers will get very much focused on, I'm going to use kind of like the common phrase, butts in the seat, like making sure people are putting in their hours. But as a manager, I would want more focus on outcomes rather than having people just in place when I think they're supposed to be.
Indeed. But I also going to want to kind of flip it around, because actually, I think responsibility falls on both sides of the equation as well. Right?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's not just on the managers, though I will say, I think remote managers need to have stronger skills than in-person managers. And maybe that's controversial, but I think that to be a good remote manager requires a lot more.
Well, I think it's, if you think about the kind of leadership development that many companies kind of go through, and in many kind of universities and books and all these things, they talk about much of the things that they talk about. It's the implicit assumption is that everything's done face to face. And so you're absolutely right, because when you can remove the face-to-face environment, then it actually, what it does do, it sort of, you create this space where there's kind of there's a big kind of gap, and that gap is around, I guess, communication, understanding the task at hand, breaking it down, kind of, agreeing kind of what needs to get done by when, and then just focusing on those outcomes rather than it being that like traditional butts and seats type of, this is my herd of cattle, as it were, and they're all in the pen, and therefore all is good with the world, whereas rather than kind of just letting them out and just roam around, and you go like, and then when you ring the bell, then they all come back to kind of in time for kind of like feeding time. Or that's a really bad analogy, probably.
I love the analogy, even though there's parts of it that may not work great, but I think you're hitting on something that's important, and that's that we're using really outdated framework. We've changed so quickly in how we work that we haven't adapted our management styles. And I think your analogy does illustrate that.
Yeah.
I do want to go back at some point to give the managers their to-do list. I realize I only got through 2 of them, and then we got sidetracked with butts in the seat.
Let's kind of kind of like we're rewound back kind of, so now kind of add on the kind of the remaining bits of the list.
Okay. So we left off on, keeping those regular one-on-one meetings. For managers who are listening and thinking about what to do for their remote workers, it's really important to establish equality for remote meetings. And what I mean by that is very practical and very easy to implement. Have you ever been a person who's in a meeting that's remote, but some of the people in the meeting are together in the same room?
Yes.
How does it feel?
So actually, I was in the meeting, but there were people that were remote. So I've not done the remote dialing into an in-person kind of meeting. But I can imagine that's sort of hard because you're like, if you want to just put your hand up, it's a bit like, or you have these kind of like things on the, meeting platforms now where you can raise your hand, digitally, as it were. And I guess that's the thing, because I was talking to somebody else about this the other day, and it feels like those sort of hybrid meetings, particularly when you fold in, people being increasingly conscious about not traveling where they don't need to travel because of the impact on, for environmental and cost concerns and all this sort of stuff, because we've shown that much of that is more possible now. And it feels like there's an emerging sort of skill around meeting facilitation, particularly in that hybrid environment, to make sure it's all balanced and respectful of everybody's kind of view. And that's just new. And I think it will emerge, but that will become a thing. Like a proper skill, how you can manage that type of hybrid kind of meeting, because I think it probably is quite difficult to do really well.
Yes, I mean, from my experience and being a person who's remote and other people are in person, there might be like little side conversations that they can all hear, but as a remote person, you cannot hear. And it's very exclusionary. It makes you feel like othered from the rest of the group. You can't participate in the conversations as well. So what you were getting at is my recommendation, and it's really easy to implement. If you have hybrid teams, everyone is going to be on their own separate laptop and joining the meeting remotely, so that there's that equality there. Everyone's meeting in the same place. No one's missing the side conversations. It's all available in the chat.
Right. Okay. I see.
Yeah.
That might be a little bit weird if you've got a bunch of people that are doing it remotely and then a bunch of people that are in a room, and the people in the room are all heads down on the kind of laptop, kind of chatting away in the chat, and sort of like, I mean, not that it's going to feel a bit weird because it's just new, but yes, you have to kind of do some different things to include everybody, because you've got to respect the nature and the difference.
Yeah, so typically people will actually take their meetings in their office, even though they're all in the same, like many of them are in the same office. But you are touching on something, and I definitely want to revisit it. I want to finish our list for managers, sure. But one thing is that, connection and kind of being part of the workplace culture is pretty reduced when you work remotely. So let's revisit that. But one of the other recommendations I have for managers is actually to increase flexibility for all workers. And what I mean by this is, remote workers can work from home, kind of put a load of laundry in, take care of things, and also manage their work. But in-person workers may not have, the flexibility to step away for a doctor's appointment or phone calls in the same way. I really recommend making sure this is more equal. For one, it helps eliminate the belief that remote workers are not as committed and are, occupied with their own stuff. It allows in-person workers to feel more equality, because there can very much be this sense of unfairness. If it's like, well, remote workers can go and, go to their dentist appointment without taking PTO, but I have to take PTO.
Right.
So increasing that fairness and flexibility ultimately is great for everyone. And then the final one So before we get sidetracked, I'm like trying to wrap it up so
Sure.
we don't, because we'll go down a rabbit hole soon, I'm sure. Is to standardize performance evaluation methods. Like we mentioned before, we're using outdated framework to manage a remote workforce, and it just hasn't been updated. And so you want to make sure that your performance evaluation methods function equally well in person and for remote workers. So you can't just count on things that you casually observed. You need to make sure that what you're including in those evaluations are things that you can pick up equally in meetings and by reviewing your employees' work.
Okay.
So that's the list of 5.
Nice. Well, that's kind of it. We'll kind of condense that down. I mean, in summary, the 5 headlines would be.
Okay, so number 1, formalize those work policies. Really communicate about what's expected. Number 2, always keep those regular one-on-one meetings and make sure you're being consistent and that they're effective. Number 3, establish that equality for remote meetings where everyone is, on their own laptops so that no one's left out. Number 4, increase flexibility for all workers. So make sure that everyone is on equal standing in terms of their schedule and what's expected of them. And then number 5 is to standardize performance evaluation methods. This is really important because it is a direct connection to promotion opportunities.
Yeah. Perfect. I mean, it's a good list. And you talk about kind of culture and kind of things, and the remote culture is kind of different, or it's hard when you're working remotely to participate in the kind of culture. But I guess I want to come back to that sort of thing around. Again, I raised the idea, right? Responsibility sits on both sides. And I guess it's related to the ideas like culture is not necessarily what you get given. Culture is kind of what you make in many ways. And that means that even if you're remote, you've got to participate. You've got to take responsibility for your own sort of actions and your own visibility and your own kind of contribution and all these different sort of things. Because, we're all human. We have frailties. We have blind spots. We have all these different sort of things. Nobody's going to necessarily perfect. People will try and be better. Some people are just don't. They're lazy, or they're just not great at doing all this sort of stuff. But there's a responsibility on the individual if you're working remotely or you're working kind of hybrid to take care of yourself and to speak up for yourself. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the article really focuses on the managers and what the manager's responsibility is. But there's definitely a responsibility for remote workers. And part of that, as you mentioned, is advocating for themselves, making sure, for example, that they're highlighting their accomplishments or seeking out, career development. Whereas, when you're in person, those opportunities you might just come upon, you might just overhear of a cool training that's going on. But when you're remote, it does require, I believe, more initiative on the remote workers' part.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Elora, is there anything else that we've missed out that you'd like to add before we can start to round it up and I'd ask you some more sort of finishing off questions?
Sure. I think there's just one piece we touched on but didn't dig deeper into.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something, I would like to actually focus on in my research about later. And I think it's something that's been neglected by academics, practitioners, and press. It's this idea of really what remote managers need to do in order to be effective.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the big things. And, kind of going to your side and your point of view, we could also write a whole article about what remote employees need to do to be effective as well.
Yeah.
And actually, I think my recommendations would fit for both, really.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like, particularly if you're talking about, those one-to-one meetings and things,
Mm-hmm.
is hold those one-to-one meetings, hold people to account for them. Make sure that they happen. If they get rescheduled, don't let it slide. Get it in the calendar again or something. But again, it's that sort of thing around you've got to take responsibility for your own performance, but also kind of like where you need help, but also how you communicate kind of what's going on and how you're getting on and what help you need and what you've produced and so on and so forth. So you can't be a passive actor and then expect good things to happen. I think you have to become proactive in your own performance and in your own sort of career and your own output and your own achievement, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great summary for both managers and remote workers. This idea of being an active agent in everything you do. And I really want to put the emphasis on how important communication skills become for those who are working remotely or working with a remote team.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And can I just say for the record and on recording, what I don't mean when I say people need to become more proactive, I'm not saying that you should try and be somebody that you're not. I'm not saying that you should all be kind of like whooping and hollering and everything's kind of like, great and crazy and happy and blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying that you should be that, because you could be the most, quiet and kind of introverted kind of person, but you can find a way of communicating what you need. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be like this. It could just be a written thing. It could be a spoken thing. Just do it in your own style, but you need to do it for yourself. Not asking you to be anybody else but yourself. But just you've got to be proactive in the best way that works for you.
Yeah, you saying that really kind of spoke to me. I've got a personal example of that. In remote team meetings, you definitely have people who are the wooers and the, like cheers. And for me, that's not as much me. I'm not quite as like kind of out there. I'm very much an introvert. But I have found my way of interacting and communicating. And that's a lot of times after a meeting, I just reach out with a quick note and kind of say, hey, congratulations on, your sales record this past month. It's awesome to hear that. And I think that's a piece of it too, is not only being proactive, but being authentic to yourself when you're doing so.
Sure, absolutely. So Elora, let me kind of like say switch gears a little bit, and maybe this is going to be a leading question, but I want to ask you about what do you think the future of this sort of experience kind of future service and experience. And I'm sort of wondering when I'm going to answer the question for you, that because I'm thinking about the future and what key challenges we need to face and what obstacles we need to get around. And it feels to me as if one of the big areas that we're going to need to get smarter on very quickly is how do we manage and lead in a remote environment, and how do we build that into kind of like, how do we make that work in combination with working face-to-face and also kind of working remote. So to get that real hybrid, new era hybrid style of kind of leadership. I mean, is that the biggest thing, do you think, that's coming down the tracks for us that we're going to have to get our heads around?
I think that's one of the challenges. Yeah, I would certainly say that is one of the challenges facing organizations. It's something that we just haven't prepared well for. I think there's another piece of it too, though. And I think it kind of goes along with one of your interests, which is customer experience. More and more of what we offer to customers, given the pandemic, it's been sped up, but is a pretty remote experience as well, or, app-based and online fulfillment. As a quick example, I can type into my app, order a full meal from McDonald's, walk down the street, pick it up, and have paid through the app, and never speak to a single person during that trip. And that is something that is very unique to our current times that did not happen several years ago.
Yeah. So I know we talked about a lot in the last few minutes, and people might be listen to this, and they might be operating in that hybrid sort of thing, and they're going, "This is great, but my head's all spinning now." And so, could you boil it down for us, and say, give us some really clear or your best advice to someone listening in that wants to improve their employee experience and become a better kind of leader in this new, changing and emerging sort of environment. I mean, if you were to go do these things, what would be your best advice?
I'm going to give some really broad advice first, and then I'm going to kind of bring it down to more like practical things you can really do. But my number one advice for being a successful leader is to listen so that you can provide the right amount of structure for employees to excel. So really understanding what their current talents are, what kind of difficulties they face, motivations, their needs, understanding all of that can help you set the stage so that they can have reasonable goals that are motivating to them. And I think that's ultimately what most employees want, is to be listened to and to have a place where they can succeed.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. Did you want to boil those down into anything more tactical than that, or is that's the umbrella one that you think, yeah, we just need to do that?
Yes. Okay. So essentially, it's to provide that right amount of structure. And ultimately, that's what all employees want, is to feel that they've been listened to and they have the tools and resources they need to be successful. So that involves specifically starting conversations with employees to ask, what are your needs? Another part is being observant and understanding what areas they struggle in and what areas they excel in. And the final thing I would really add, and I think there's a shortage of this in many workplaces, is really supporting employees with both reflection and recognition after a task is done. So let's say you complete a project, actually setting that space for employees to say, what went well, what can be done better, and then also as a manager or a leader, telling them what you think they did well. Everyone likes the pat on the back.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yeah, that's great advice. So, one final thing, or two final things before we kind of go. So, and I've been doing this for crumbs the longest time. At the end of all these interviews, I've been doing this, I don't know, call it longitudinal social research, social kind of word association research, let's say. And it's based around, I published Punk CX back in 2019, and then I've just published this follow-up called Punk XL, which stands for, which explores what experienced leadership is and what it looks like, and so on and so forth. And for the longest time, I've just been asking people about what they think Punk CX means, and what I'm doing is sort of adding one on to that. So I've got two questions for you, bit sort of quick fire. So what one or two words would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience?
Adaptive.
Adaptive. We like that. That's a good one. Fantastic.
Yeah. I think one of your comments about, how customer service kind of became more flat and it became more automatic and less personalized. I think something that we really need to develop is being more adaptive to customer experiences and needs.
Awesome. And then the one that's kind of more about the XL part, the experience leadership that I sort of talked about before we got started. So what company or brand do you think is an experienced leader, and why?
Yeah, so we kind of chatted about this a little bit before, because I was struggling with thinking of a current company or brand that's really doing this well. One of my older examples was Herb Keller, who really managed Southwest through a difficult time. And they did it with character. And I think that is really meaningful. But in current times with the pandemic, I haven't seen many news articles or read very much about companies that are really nailing it right now.
Right.
Companies that are listening and honoring their employees while also giving their customers and clients a fantastic experience. It seems like even companies that we really put on a pedestal have been kind of looked down upon for some of their policies. Google has always been thought of, in the past as like an amazing place to work. But I've seen critiques of their return to office plans back when we were returning to the office.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's a really interesting kind of point, and maybe this idea of experienced leadership is setting the bar that many have yet to reach.
It could be, or I don't know if it's just the current circumstances have made it harder to be an Excel leader.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's undoubtedly so. And because it's almost like there's got too many shifting sort of like many of them are on shifting sands, and they're sort of figuring it out as they go along. And in doing that, making sort of missteps. And so it's almost like the variety has just exploded, and they're still trying to find their way. But I'm sure they will, in due course, and they will, those leaders will kind of as organizations and as people and as teams will emerge. But Elora, that's all I have for you today. And so I just want to say thank you for sharing your time and your insight and your experience with us today. That's been super cool.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was stimulating.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.